In the HBO world, blue dragon flame is associated with the dumbest plot twist that D&D could have cooked up. But in Martin's world, dragons are spewing forth colored jets of flame all the time. As deadly as these jets are, they're also beautiful. Dragons are beasts of war, but when they're not agitated, they're the most wondrous creatures in the known world. And the most wondrous of the last generation of dragons has to be the Blue Queen. For a while, we were scared that we wouldn't get to see Tessarion at all, considering all the rumors regarding Daeron's omission from House of the Dragon. But now that we know he exists, and that Otto is likely on his way to meet the prince, we think it's the perfect time to talk about his royal steed. So without further ado, this is Tessarion's anatomy, explained. And before we go any further, this is your spoiler warning, because there will be a lot of those in this video. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Birth and bonding. Prince Daeron and Tessarion. Like we discussed in our Sunfire and Dragon Egg anatomy videos, the process of hatching a dragon's egg requires a few special conditions. Heat is essential, for the Targaryen family's hatcheries were located within the Dragonmont volcano on Dragonstone. Proximity to Targaryens could also be another factor, as many Targaryen princes and princesses received dragon eggs in their cradles, which hatched and bonded with them far quicker than wild dragons. Daenerys Targaryen used blood magic to revive and hatch 3 fossilized dragon eggs, birthing Drogon, Viserion, and Rhaegal. And all this is to say that there's no way Tessarion was born in King's Landing, because the dragon pit lacks a source of fire, save for the dragons it houses. She was likely birthed in the hatcheries of Dragonstone, and was one of the few hatchlings lucky or clever enough to survive the scourge that was the cannibal. This coal-black cannibalistic dragon would often feast upon the dragon eggs that lay vulnerable within Dragonmont, and hatchlings that couldn't defend themselves as well. That's probably why Westeros isn't teeming with dragons, but that's for another video. For this one, what we need to focus on is the fact that the Blue Queen was a resourceful enough dragon to stay safe from a predator on the prowl. Dragons derive their coloring from the patterns on their eggs, and Tessarion must have looked a lot like the blue dragon egg Rhaenyra gives Rhaena to take to the Vale, only a lot more beautiful. Tessarion's coloring is described as being dark cobalt, with her claws, crest, and belly scales looking like bright beaten copper. This means that her egg must have had a dark cobalt base, with copper inflections and enhancements adorning its scales. Tessarion's flames were described as being cobalt in color as well, so you can see why we said she's going to give us Night King Viserion flashbacks, and not in a cool way. House of the Dragon has decided not to animate the colored flames in Martin's dragons, opting to invest in their majestic forms instead. The decision has paid off massively, because none of the dragons from the show look like they've just been given different skin colors in a video game. The dragons are more individualistic, more distinguishable, and more personable in House of the Dragon, and we really appreciate that. But it would have been cool seeing colored flames as well, especially from Sunfire and Tessarion. Speaking of Sunfire, let's now talk about Tessarion's age. There's no mention of how old Tessarion actually is, just that she's younger than Sunfire. Tessarion is the youngest dragon on the green side by far, and this is backed up by the stories of her claiming as well. The Blue Queen's first and only rider was the Crown Prince Daeron. The timeline of his birth might be slightly different in the show, considering they aged up Jacaerys and Luke, and aged down Prince Joffrey. In Fire and Blood, Daeron is born the same year as Jace. Even at that age, the resentment towards Rhaenyra's children from Alicent's children was palpable. Prince Aegon and Aemond already disliked their elder half-sister for taking their birthright. When Jace was born, Viserys declared that he and Daeron would become milk brothers, and wean from the teat of the same wet nurses. But that didn't improve relations either. With the arrival of Luke and Joff, the number of crown princes on each side was equaled, and both Rhaenyra and Alicent's children spent their entire lives clashing with one another. Unlike Rhaenyra, who placed a dragon's egg in the cradle of all her children, Alicent did not. So Daeron likely followed the path of his brothers and sisters, and claimed Tessarion independently. It's said that Daeron was 6 years old by the time he had a dragon of his own, but he hadn't ridden her yet. This could be due to a number of factors. For starters, Tessarion could be too small to ride at the time. Dragons that are younger are much easier to bond with because they haven't developed personalities of their own. On Dragonstone, there are many wild dragons that have lived willful lives for so long that trying to claim them would mean certain death. Dragons who get accustomed to human presence, like Syrax, Vermithor, and Silverwing, don't roast them on sight, but will do so if roused. Hatchlings are the best to bond with because they're too young to do any significant damage, and the dragon bond seems to strengthen rider and dragon both. Aegon the Conqueror's son, Aenys, was a sickly babe whose health was a major concern for the king, until he bonded with the hatchling Quicksilver. Then as the dragon grew stronger, so did the prince, and Aenys managed to live for a rather decent amount of time. Conversely, it could be that Daeron's youth prevented him from flying his dragon, because he was 6 years old when he claimed her. The point here is that the younger a dragon is, the better the bond will be with its first rider. Tessarion's first and only rider was Daeron, and if he claimed her at his ancestor's island citadel when she was too young, it would make sense why he couldn't fly her. Instead, he brought her to the capital with him, and had her housed within Dragon Pit. The Blue Queen was part of the last generation of living and fighting dragons in the history of the Targaryen dynasty, so it makes sense that she went away from the Great Stone Stable to spread her wings and grow. The Dragon at Old Town, Tessarion's breed, size at the start of war. It's well established within the lore of Ice and Fire that the Targaryen dragons housed within the Dragon Pit never reached the size of their ancestors, who had the freedom to hunt and fly. The same must be true for Tessarion. The Blue Queen spent over half a decade in King's Landing, making her lair within the cavernous vaults of the Dragon Pit. But when Daeron turned 12, she got an opportunity to truly spread her wings. 3 years before the outbreak of civil war, Daeron was sent to Old Town to serve as a cupbearer and squire to Lord Ormond Hightower, Queen Alicent's cousin brother. This was likely done in accordance with tradition, rather than fear of war. In Westeros, it was a custom for young nobles to serve as cupbearers and squires to other lords while they came of age. Fulfilling such roles taught them a lot about duty and ruling, and out of all of Alicent's children, Daeron had always been the most promising. He took direction much better than his elder brothers, and if he was molded right, he would outshine Aegon and Aemond as a prince of the crown. Alicent sent him to Old Town to make sure he took the right direction from the right family, but it could also have been a precautionary measure, considering that same year, Rhaenyra executed one of her in-laws. In Fire and Blood, it's the Princess of Dragonstone, not King Viserys, who addresses Vaemond Valyrian's accusations. She has her husband execute him, and his body fed to her dragon. While all of Alicent's children had dragons of their own, Daeron's was the youngest, and by far the weakest. Tessarion most likely belonged to the racing-type dragon breed, considering she was described as being nimble in the air. This type has been used by Martin quite frequently to describe dragons that were faster than others but also smaller. So despite being the youngest of the green dragons, Tessarion was likely the fastest as well. Sunfire outranked it by age and size, but it was said to be a heavy dragon, implying he had a lot of power but not a lot of speed. Granny Vhagar is pretty much a battered bomber at this point, so to expect insane blitzes from her is beyond unrealistic. Dreamfire was rather similar to Tessarion in her youth, but she's approaching a century by the time of the dance, and her natural speed would have surely suffered with age. This makes Tessarion undoubtedly the fastest dragon on the green side, and that could just be down to her breed. Tessarion and Sunfire are distant in the age bracket, but they're also rather different in their builds. Sunfire's heavy and formidable frame is something that lends itself perfectly to warfare, while Tessarion's slender, nimbler frame is best suited for fast flying. So while she might be the weakest of the Green's dragons, Tessarion had advantages of her own, and she wouldn't remain small and weak for too long, because once Daeron went to Old Town, she got the freedom she was denied at King's Landing. Old Town is the oldest city in the Seven Kingdoms, and its origins have been lost to time. There are tales that say dragons roosted upon its walls back in the Dawn Age, but then the first Hightowers killed or ousted them, and since then, they've been ruling the mouth of the Honeywine with an iron fist. Old Town was briefly considered to become the new capital of the Seven Kingdoms following Aegon's coronation, but the Conqueror decided to rule from King's Landing instead. So even if a restrictive structure like the Dragon Pit could have been built within its walls, it wasn't, and that means Tessarion was free to fly and hunt as she pleased. Before the creation of the Dragon Pit, the Targaryens kept their dragons at their castles, and some continue to do so even after it was built. Jaehaerys and Alysanne famously kept their dragons at the Red Keep. Vermithor and Silverwing grew much larger than pit dragons like Caraxes or Melis ever did, and maesters have speculated this is because they had more space and resources to grow. Even with her nimble frame, if Tessarion was allowed to hunt and rest as she pleased, she would reach fighting size before any of Rhaenyra's children's hatchlings did, and that's exactly what happens. Old Town has some of the most fertile land holdings in all of southern Westeros. East of the city walls, Tessarion could hunt boar, deer, and all sorts of game and livestock from the forests of the Dornish marches. She would have become a regular sight at nearby black-aligned Horn Hill and Highgarden, which remained neutral throughout the dance. If that was not to her taste, she could hunt for fish and other aquatic life from the waters of the Honeywine River and the bay called Whispering Sound. With time, she could even fly off into the Sunset Sea. But whenever Tessarion finished feeding and hunting, she would always return to roost beside her rider. It's unclear where she made her lair during her time at Old Town. Dragons can live in the open fields for as long as needed, but most often they prefer resting within cave-like lairs. When Daenerys Targaryen confines Viserion and Rhaegal in the pits beneath the Great Pyramid of Meereen, there it's only 2 inhabitants, and yet they carve out lairs into the 30 feet thick walls using flame and claw. Most Targaryen dragons lived either within the Dragonmont, where several lairs had been constructed and carved out through the centuries, or within the Dragon Pit of King's Landing. Only one dragon had lived away from King's Landing or Dragonstone for an extended period of time before Tessarion, and that was Dreamfire. She spent a few years on Fair Isle, off the coast of the Westerlands, but Fair Isle was close to a mountainous region, so making a lair wouldn't have been tough for Dreamfire. Tessarion could have also created a lair within the Red Mountains, which was the closest mountain range to Old Town, but this would have proven counterproductive. The reach end of the marches was protected by House Tarly, who had declared for Rhaenyra during the dance. If Tessarion were to make her home near their lands, she would be under threat of attack at all times. Instead, she probably stayed atop the high tower, and might have even dazzled the throngs of Old Town with her great leathern wings. Over half a century ago, Queen Alysanne Targaryen visited Old Town to attend the funeral of a High Septon. During her stay, Silverwing would alight upon the high tower, and fan its beacon flames with her wings, dazzling everyone who bore witness to it. The high tower is the tallest tower in the known world, taller than the wall as well, which is 700 feet high. Such a massive structure would require incredible width as well to support it, and the beacon fires of the high tower were the ideal environs for Tessarion to relax at when she wasn't out flying. During her 3 years at Old Town, she grew truly massive, for her size was said to be a third of Vermithor's. Vermithor's size was second only to Vhagar, so you can roughly picture Tessarion's true size. And it's kind of surprising that she reached that size, considering Seasmoke was known to be older than her. And yet they were equals. Seasmoke was a young dragon when he bonded with 7-year-old Laenor Velaryon. Laenor didn't ride him at the time, but would do so later. That's the exact same description of Daeron's claiming of Tessarion. Only those 2 events occurred close to 2 decades apart from one another. Also, Tessarion is said to be younger than Sunfire, who himself should technically be younger than Seasmoke, considering Aegon was born over a half a decade after Laenor claimed Seasmoke. A likely explanation for this discrepancy is that Tessarion and Seasmoke were born close to one another, while Sunfire was older than the both of them. However, that would mean both of them would have enough time to develop personalities of their own, which would make bonding with princes as young as Daeron much more difficult. The second explanation is that Tessarion simply grew at a rapid pace, and she must have, for her size was the same as Seasmoke's at the beginning of the dance. Old Town's environs would certainly lend themselves to such a rapid growth. The Blue Queen was said to be far fiercer than her pale gray counterpart though, likely because she's much younger than him. Seasmoke had also spent more time with its former rider than Daeron had on Planetos, so there is that as well. However, more than her size and her beauty, what makes Tessarion one of the most important dragons in the dance is the fact that she's likely the only one present south of King's Landing. Much of the fighting of the Civil War takes place north of the Blackwater, with the Riverlands and Dragonstone being the focal points. The Westerlands and the Stormlands officially declare for Aegon, so there are far fewer rebellions in those realms. But the Reach is divided between Black and Green for most of the war. House Hightower is the richest and largest supporter of the Greens, but even its massive army of over 20,000 soldiers would have been broken down over time, with the pincer tactics of the Blacks. In the show, we're told Ormond Hightower is on the march and departed Old Town weeks ago. The reason he's getting delayed is because he's beset on all sides by enemies, and his path only becomes clearer once Tessarion is involved. The Blue Queen saves the Hightower army from a major ambush, burning thousands of Black Aligned soldiers, and since she's the only dragon in the south, her strength goes unopposed. Ormond dubs her rider Daeron the Daring for turning the tide at the battle on the Honeywine, but the young prince defers the victory to his dragon instead. Thereafter, the Green's advance becomes much smoother because none of the Reach Lords wanted to face Tessarion in open battle. The reason she was kept back during Ormond's initial march was likely that Daeron was too young to participate. He was only 15 at the time of the dance, and while his dragon was of fighting size, Daeron was too valuable an asset to risk. Targaryens had been dying left, right, and center those days, and should anything happen to Daeron's brothers, he would become their heir. As much, Ormond likely wished to preserve the Hightower's key to the throne, but when he saw the destruction of his army being imminent, he had to include Tessarion in his plans. The Blue Queen proved crucial as a scout, for she was able to alert the Hightower army of incoming ambushes well before they took place. Her presence also put down many rebellions in the Reach. bringing House Oakhart, House Rowan, and the Shield Islands to Aegon's side. She could have been the deciding factor in the battle for King's Landing had the Hightowers lingered south long enough for the rest of the dragons to die out. But alas, the Targaryen Civil War was called the Dance of the Dragons, and every single dragon alive of fighting size was involved in a conflict with its own kind. So it was for Tessarion as well, although it's hard to tell whether what happened between her and Seasmoke was a battle or an actual dance. Tessarion vs. Seasmoke, battle or mating dance? For much of the Reach campaign, Prince Daeron faced little to no trouble. He flew at the head of a truly massive army, and he had a dragon to keep an eye out for trouble, and burn it if need be. He also had a bit of that Targaryen fire inside of him, because in Fire and Blood, he does something his ancestors did at Harrenhal, the Sept of Remembrance, and 100 other castles. This might not occur in the show, considering the Catalyst character has been written out entirely, but in the books, Daeron burned Bitterbridge in revenge. After Prince Jaehaerys' death, Aegon's other son Maelor is sent toward Lord Ormond's army for safekeeping, but he's discovered and brutally murdered at Bitterbridge. Daeron avenges his nephew by burning Bitterbridge with Tessarion and sacking it afterward. Though he was Alicent's best son, he too possessed a streak of violence like his brothers, and had a stronger desire to prove himself, for he'd always been sidelined on account of his age. Tessarion then flew to the city of Tumbleton, the final black stronghold in the Reach, and it's here where she gets involved in the Battle of Dragons. Following a series of battles and betrayals that saw her lose her rider, the Blue Queen was faced by the dragon we've been comparing her to all this while, Seasmoke. There were considerable differences between the two at the time of their encounter. For starters, Tessarion was riderless. Seasmoke had a new rider in Adam Valerian, but the Blue Queen was far more vicious than Seasmoke, and it showed in her approach. When she rose to meet him in battle, she shrieked and spit flames while rising in the sky. But once she got there, things changed. Dragons usually do not fight using fire. Their scales are protected against flames, and fire is used only as a distraction in a fight, or as a means of softening up the opponent. Teeth, claws, and tails were more commonly used in a dragon fight, as we saw during Arax vs. Vhagar. Arax shot fire at Vhagar's eye because the eyes are the only vulnerable spot on a dragon's body. It was probably trying to blind her, but Vhagar didn't waste its breath at all. She simply chomped down on Arax and her rider, because that's how dragons fought one another. And yet, when Tessarion met Seasmoke in the sky, their battle felt more like a dance. Both dragons would speed at each other and then pull away at the last possible moment. They would spit flames on each other, but never harm one another, seeming to engage more in play than war. This situation was clearly out of Sir Adam's control because he was there to prove his loyalty, and playing rain dance with a dragon instead of killing it was the opposite of that. Seasmoke was likely controlling his own actions in that moment, which made many question what this dance was. Many speculate that it was a mating routine, and this would make a lot of sense. In the animal kingdom, many species of bird and reptiles go through a sequence of movements that are akin to a dance in order to attract a mate. Martin based his dragons off of real-world reptiles, so a dance involving flight and flame feels like an appropriate mating ritual for dragons. We'll never find out if this one was consummated, because in the middle of their dragon dance, Tessarion and Seasmoke were interrupted by their bane. The death of the last green dragon, how Tessarion died. 4 dragons were present at the Second Battle of Tumbleton, but only one of them belonged to the Blacks. While one of the green dragons did not engage, the other 2 did, and the largest of them was thrice as large as Seasmoke and Tessarion. Together, they'd probably stand a chance against it, but Tessarion was fighting off instinct now, not direction. Once Adam realized this, he turned to meet the larger threat, and that threat ended up finishing off all 3 of the belligerent dragons. Seasmoke smashed down on his enemy, but ended up getting pinned in the mud and being decapitated. Before that could occur, though, Tessarion also joined the battle, and fought the dragon that was supposed to be her ally. All 3 dragons tore each other apart, but the Blue Queen lived the longest after the bloodshed. Tessarion was mortally injured by her battle with 2 other dragons, but being the youngest of them all, she lived on. Thrice did she try to fly, her destination presumably being Dragonstone, but she couldn't muster enough strength to take off, and in the end, she was put out of her misery with 3 arrows to the eye. After her death, her skull was presumably carried to the Red Keep, where it was put on display with 18 others. Tessarion repeated the Conqueror's feats at Harrenhal and the Field of Fire, but she wouldn't have a legacy similar to his dragon, thanks to the dance. Marvelous verdict, and that's all for this one. Let us know what you thought in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you guys next time, and until then, remember, history is written in fire and blood.